Chapter 1. Iris Marl. Rosemary Barton died from cyanide poisoning nearly a year ago. Iris Marl was thinking about her sister, Rosemary Barton. For nearly a year, she had tried to forget the blue face, the twisted fingers. The difference between that and the lovely, happy Rosemary of the day before. Well, perhaps not happy. She had been ill. She was tired and depressed. That's why she had killed herself, wasn't it? But last night, Rosemary's husband, George Barton, had called her into his study and shown her those letters. And now she had to remember the past. Pictures came into her mind. Herself as a small child, eating bread and milk, and Rosemary, 6 years older, doing schoolwork at a table. Rosemary going to boarding school and coming home for the holidays. Rosemary going to live in Paris and coming home an elegant, beautiful woman with red gold hair and dark blue eyes. Rosemary's life became full of late breakfasts in bed, lunches with girlfriends and evening dances, while Iris still went to school, walked in the parks, ate supper at 9 o'clock, and was in bed by 10. And then Rosemary had married George Barton. Iris still wondered why. So many exciting young men had been courting her, while George Barton was 15 years older than herself, kind, pleasant, and extremely dull. It wasn't money. Rosemary already had Uncle Paul's money. Paul Bennett wasn't really an uncle. He had been in love with their mother, but she had chosen another, poorer man, Hector Marl. Paul had accepted his defeat and remained a family friend. He had become known as Uncle Paul and was godfather to Rosemary. When he died, he left his entire fortune to his 13-year-old goddaughter. So why had the rich and beautiful Rosemary married boring George Barton? She hadn't loved him, but she had been happy with him and was very fond of him. A year later, Iris and Rosemary's mother, Viola Marl, had died. Their father, Hector, had died many years before. And so, at the age of 17, Iris went to live with Rosemary and George in Elveston Square. Iris had not seen much of her sister in those days. Rosemary was always out shopping or going to parties. But she had seemed happy enough until that day, a week before it happened, when Iris had entered Rosemary's sitting room to find her sitting at her desk and weeping bitterly. Iris had never seen Rosemary cry before. It frightened her, although Rosemary had been ill with influenza, and she knew that it could leave you depressed. "Rosemary, what's wrong?" she cried. Rosemary wiped her tear-stained face. "Nothing," she said angrily. Then she stood up and ran out of the room. Puzzled, Iris walked over to the table and saw her own name on a page of notepaper. Rosemary had been writing to her. She read the note. "Darling Iris, there isn't any point in making a will because my money goes to you anyway. But I'd like some of my things to be given to particular people. To George, the jewelry he's given me. To Gloria King, my cigarette case. To Maisie." The note stopped there. What did it mean? Rosemary wasn't going to die. She had been very ill, but she was better now. "My money goes to you anyway." Iris had always thought Uncle Paul's fortune would go to George if Rosemary died, but it said here that the money would come to her instead. That did make things rather less unfair. She was surprised by the thought. Had she felt it was unfair for Rosemary to get all Uncle Paul's money? Perhaps, deep in her heart she had. Rosemary always had everything: parties, pretty dresses, young men in love with her, and an adoring husband. Iris picked up the unfinished letter and put it safely away in the drawers of the desk. After the fatal birthday party, it was used to prove that Rosemary had been depressed after her illness and might have been considering suicide. Depression after influenza was the verdict given at the inquest. Now, Iris wondered how she had not been able to see the truth. After Rosemary's funeral, the family lawyer had explained the details of Paul Bennett's will to Iris. Rosemary had inherited his fortune, and she was meant to pass it on to her own children when she died. But if she died childless, the money would go to Iris when she reached the age of 21, or when she got married. George invited Iris to continue living with him. He suggested that her aunt, Mrs. Lucilla Drake, should also come and live with them. Mrs. Drake had very little money of her own because her son spent it all, and so she was very pleased by George's invitation. Iris had happily agreed to the arrangement. George treated her like a younger sister, and Mrs. Drake, who was a rather silly woman, let her do just as she pleased. The new household settled down comfortably together. 6 months after Rosemary's death, Iris had gone up into the attic of the house to look for a favorite jumper, which was packed away in a suitcase of unused clothes. Searching through the suitcase, she found an old robe that had belonged to Rosemary and felt something in one of the pockets. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a letter in Rosemary's handwriting. "Darling, I know you don't mean it. We love each other. We can't just say goodbye. We belong together, forever and ever. I don't care what people say. Love matters more than anything. You once said that life was nothing without me. And now you say that our relationship must end. But I can't live without you. Can't. George will understand that it isn't right to live together if you don't love each other anymore. We'll be wonderfully happy, darling. But we must be brave. I shan't tell George until after my birthday. Oh, darling." The letter ended here. So, Rosemary had had a lover, and she had planned to go away with him. Who was this unknown man? Did he love Rosemary as much as she loved him? He must have done. And yet, he had suggested ending it. Was he tired of her? It seemed that he had wanted to end the affair, but that Rosemary had disagreed. Rosemary had had many admirers, but there had been no one special, had there? Iris frowned. Could it have been Stephen Faraday? People said he was a brilliant politician, a possible future prime minister. Was that the attraction? Surely Rosemary couldn't really have loved such a cold, unemotional man. But it must be Stephen Faraday. Because if it wasn't, it had to be Anthony Brown. And Iris didn't want it to be Anthony Brown. Anthony had been devoted to Rosemary, but he had disappeared after her death, and no one had seen him since. Of course, he traveled a lot. He had mentioned South America, Canada, Uganda, and the USA. Iris thought he was actually American, although his accent was very slight, and there was no reason why he should have continued to visit the rest of them. He was Rosemary's friend, after all. But Iris didn't want him to have been Rosemary's lover. That would hurt terribly. She wanted to throw the letter away, but something stopped her from doing it. One day, it might be necessary to show someone that letter, to explain why Rosemary killed herself. So instead, she took it downstairs and locked it in her jewelry box. Rosemary had died in November. In May, Iris, assisted by her Aunt Lucilla, had entered London's social world. She went to lunches, teas, and dances, but she didn't enjoy them very much. It was at a rather boring dance at the end of June that she had heard someone behind her say, "Iris Marl?" She had turned round and looked straight into Anthony Brown's handsome face. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "But, of course I do." She smiled. "Oh, that's splendid. It's been such a long time since I saw you." "I know, not since Rosemary's birthday par." She stopped in distress. Rosemary's birthday party, Rosemary's suicide. She wouldn't think of it. She would not. "I'm terribly sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have reminded you." Iris swallowed hard. "It's all right. Please forgive me. Shall we dance?" She nodded and floated onto the dance floor in his arms. "Where have you been all this time?" she heard herself asking. "Traveling on business." "I see. So why have you come back now?" He smiled. "To see you, Iris Marl." Since then, Iris had seen Anthony at least once a week. She walked with him in the park, sat next to him at dinner parties, danced with him. But he never came to Elveston Square, always cleverly managing to avoid accepting her invitations. She began to wonder why. Was it, perhaps, because he and Rosemary had been lovers there in the past? Then, one day, George had suddenly questioned her about the relationship. "Who's this Anthony Brown you're seeing?" he asked. "What do you know about him?" She stared at him in surprise. "Tony? He was a friend of Rosemary's." George blinked. "Oh yes, of course he was. Well, you should be careful of the fellow. You're a very rich young woman, you know." "Tony has plenty of money," she cried angrily. "Why, he's staying at Claridge's hotel." George smiled. "Very respectable and expensive. All the same, my dear, nobody knows much about him. He doesn't come to this house, does he?" "No, and I can see why if you're so horrid about him. I'm simply warning you. I'll talk to Lucilla." George did mention Anthony Brown to Aunt Lucilla, but she did not pay much attention to him at the time because her attention was focused on a telegram from her beloved son in Rio de Janeiro. "Can you send me £200? It said. "Life or death?" Victor knows I don't have much money, so he wouldn't ask for help unless it was an emergency. I'm so afraid he'll shoot himself. I would never forgive myself if I didn't do what he asked." George sighed. "I'll find out exactly what sort of trouble Victor's in. But you should let him try to get out of trouble by himself, Lucilla. He'll never take any responsibility for himself otherwise." "You're cruel, George. The poor boy has always been unlucky." George kept his thoughts about Victor to himself and decided to ask his efficient secretary to deal with it. He simply said, "I'll get Ruth to send a telegram at once. We should know by tomorrow." The £200 was eventually reduced to 50, which George paid himself. Iris told George how much she admired his kindness. "Well, there's always one loser in the family," he said, "who must be supported by the others." "But Victor isn't your family. Couldn't I do it? You're always saying how rich I am." He smiled. "Not until you're 21, and I hope you won't do it then. But I'll give you one piece of advice. When someone threatens to end his life unless he gets 200 pounds at once, 20 pounds will usually be enough, and 10 will do. You can always cut down the amount. Victor would never kill himself. The people who threaten suicide never do it." Never? What about Rosemary? Thought Iris. Since Rosemary's death, George seemed older and heavier. He had grown increasingly absent-minded and spent a lot of time deep in thought. Something serious seemed to be worrying him. Iris sometimes noticed him staring at her with a puzzled look on his face. Then he started returning early from work and going straight into his study. She had followed him in there one afternoon and found him sitting at his desk, staring into space. When she asked him what the matter was, he replied quickly, "Nothing." As time went on, he began to ask peculiar questions, such as, "Iris, did Rosemary ever talk to you?" "Of course, George. About what?" "Oh, herself, her friends. Whether she was happy, that sort of thing." Iris was afraid that George had found out about Rosemary's affair. But she didn't want to hurt him, and Rosemary had never said anything. So she shook her head. "Oh, well, it doesn't matter." He sighed. Another day he asked her who Rosemary's best friends had been. "Gloria King and Maisie Atwell," she replied. "Would she have told her secrets to them?" "I don't know. What sort of secrets do you mean?" "Well, was she afraid of anybody? Did she have any enemies?" Iris stared at him in astonishment, and his face reddened. "I just wondered." The next day he asked her how well Rosemary knew the Faradays. "I really don't know, George, but she was interested in politics. Only after she met the Faradays in Switzerland. She never thought about political matters before that. I think Stephen Faraday got her interested in the subject." What did Sandra Faraday think about that? She might resent him having a friendship with another woman. Iris felt uncomfortable. "Perhaps," she agreed. George suddenly changed the subject. "Are you still seeing Anthony Brown?" "Yes." "Isn't his business something to do with armaments?" "He has never said." "Well, he certainly spent a lot of time with Lord Dewsbury last year, and Dewsbury is the chairman of United Arms Limited. Rosemary saw a lot of Brown, too, didn't she? He took her dancing." "Yes." "I was surprised that she wanted him at her birthday party, though. She hadn't known him for long." "He dances very well." A picture of the fatal party at the Luxembourg restaurant flashed across Iris's mind. The round table, the soft lights, the 7 guests. Herself, Anthony, Rosemary, Stephen Faraday, Ruth Lessing, George and Stephen's wife, Lady Alexandra, known to her friends as Sandra. That was the first time Iris had met Tony properly. Before then, he had just been a name, a shadow in the hall waiting to escort Rosemary out to yet another party. She pulled her mind back into the present to hear George saying, "Well, do ask Brown to dinner one night, my dear." I'd like to meet him again." Iris was delighted. She gave George's invitation to Tony, and he accepted. But on the day of the dinner, he suddenly had to leave London on a business matter, and couldn't come after all. In July, George announced that he had bought a house called Little Priors in the Sussex countryside. "Will it need decorating?" asked Mrs. Drake. "Oh, Ruth is arranging all that for us." Ruth Lessing, George's efficient secretary, was pleasant and good-looking in a hard, black-and-white kind of way. George was devoted to her and relied on her completely. Lucilla Drake was annoyed. "George, dear, women do like to arrange the color scheme of their own drawing room." George looked upset. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "I'm sure Ruth will have made it perfect," said Iris. "She's so clever. What shall we do down there? Is there a tennis court?" "Yes, and it's only 14 miles to the sea. And we'll have neighbors we know, too. The Faradays own a house nearby." They spent most of August and September in Sussex. Little Priors was a handsome house, tastefully furnished and decorated. Visitors came to stay at the weekends. There were tennis parties and dinners with the Faradays. Sandra Faraday introduced them to the rest of their neighbors and advised George about buying horses. Stephen was often away in London, working on political business. Iris suspected that he was deliberately avoiding the family at Little Priors. The household had returned to London in October, and Iris had hoped that perhaps George would start behaving normally again. But then, late last night, he had knocked on her bedroom door and asked her to come into his study for a talk. Half asleep, she had agreed. Downstairs in the study, he invited her to sit down. "Is anything the matter, George?" she asked, as he lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. He looked really ill. "I can't go on alone. You must tell me if you think it's possible." He rubbed his hand over his face. "You'll understand when I've shown you these." He handed Iris 2 neatly printed letters. The first one said, "Your wife didn't commit suicide, she was killed." The second said, "Rosemary was murdered." "They came about 3 months ago," George continued. "At first I thought it was a cruel joke, but then I began to think, why would Rosemary have killed herself? Lots of people have influenza and feel a bit depressed afterwards, but Rosemary wouldn't kill herself just because she was unhappy. She might threaten to, but she wouldn't actually do it." "But what other explanation could there be, George? They found the cyanide poison in her handbag." "I know. But ever since these letters came, I've been thinking about it, and I believe they're true. That's why I asked you if Rosemary had enemies or was afraid of anyone. Whoever killed her must have had a reason, and you must help me find out, Iris. You've got to remember that night in every detail, because if she was killed, you see, the murderer must have been sitting at that table." Chapter 2. Ruth Lessing, a well-dressed, dark-haired woman of 29, was devoted to George Barton. When she had first come to work for him 6 years ago, at the age of 23, she had discovered that he was a very disorganized and inefficient man. Being a businesslike young woman, she had immediately taken control of his affairs. She had saved him time and money, chosen his friends, and advised him on his business decisions. George, Rosemary, and Iris all called her Ruth, and she spent a lot of time with them at the house in Elveston Square. Last year, in early November, not long before Rosemary's death, George had spoken to Ruth about Victor Drake. "I want you to do a rather unpleasant job for me, Ruth," he said one morning. She nodded. "My wife's cousin, Victor Drake, is a very bad man. He has ruined his mother, Lucilla, who has given him almost all her savings. He was caught forging a check while he was at Oxford University, and the family sent him abroad. He has traveled all over the world, but he never makes a success of anything he does. He's in London at the moment and has written to ask for money. I've made an appointment to meet him at 12 o'clock today at his hotel, and I want you to go in my place. I believe the matter can be kept absolutely businesslike if it's managed by a third person. What do you want me to offer him?" £100 in cash and a ticket to Buenos Aires. The money will be given to him as he gets on the boat." Ruth smiled. "You want to be sure he actually leaves?" "Indeed. Are you sure you don't mind doing this for me?" "Of course not. Here's his ticket. I've booked him onto the San Cristobal, which sails from Tilbury Docks tomorrow." Ruth put the ticket into her handbag. "Where do I meet him? At the Rupert Hotel? Russell Square?" "My dear, what would I do without you?" George put a hand on her shoulder affectionately. "You're the kindest, dearest girl in the world." Victor Drake was a very attractive man, but Ruth could sense the cold, calculating personality hidden beneath his obvious charm. He greeted her with delight. "So you're George's messenger? What a wonderful surprise." Coolly, she made George's offer, and Victor agreed to the deal at once. £100? Not bad. I would have taken 60, but don't tell George. And who's coming to see me off on the San Cristobal? You, my dear? How delightful." His dark eyes smiled in his sunburned face. "You've been with Barton for 6 years, haven't you, Miss Lessing? And he wouldn't know what to do without you." "Oh, yes, I know all about you, my dear." "How do you know?" asked Ruth sharply. Victor grinned. "Rosemary told me." "Rosemary?" "She was very nice to me. She gave me £100, actually." He laughed. Although she disapproved of his bad behavior, Ruth found herself laughing too. "That's too bad of you, Mr. Drake." "Not at all. I'm a professional beggar with an excellent technique. My mother, for example, will always send money if I send a telegram suggesting suicide." "You should be ashamed of yourself." "Oh, I am. I'm a bad man, Miss Lessing. But I do enjoy myself greatly. I've lived a very interesting life. I've been an actor, a shopkeeper, a waiter, a builder, a porter, and a circus assistant. I stood for president in a South American republic. I've been in prison, and I've never done an honest job or paid my own bills." Ruth knew she should be horrified, but Victor Drake managed to make evil seem amusing. "And you're not so good yourself, Ruth." He was looking at her closely now. "You worship success. George shouldn't have married that little fool Rosemary. He would have done much better to marry you. Rosemary's lovely, but she's got no brains at all. She's the kind of woman that men always fall in love with, but never stay with. Now, well, if a man fell in love with you, he would never grow tired of it." "But George wouldn't fall in love with me," she cried. "Oh, Ruth." If anything happened to Rosemary, George would marry you at once. You know that as well I do. You could twist him round your little finger." "It's true," thought Ruth, suddenly very angry. "If it weren't for Rosemary, I could make George marry me." Victor was watching her with amusement. He enjoyed putting ideas into people's heads, or showing them the ideas that were already there. Soon after Ruth returned to work that afternoon, Rosemary had called her on the telephone. "Oh, Ruth," she said, "Colonel Race won't be here in time for my party, so ask George who he would like to invite instead. We need another man. There are 4 women coming: Iris, Sandra Faraday, and I can't remember the other one. I'm the 4th. You very kindly asked me." "Oh, of course, I'd forgotten." Rosemary laughed and ended the call. At that moment, Ruth Lessing realized that she hated Rosemary Barton. Hated her for being rich and beautiful and careless and brainless. She didn't need to work in an office. Everything had been handed to her on a golden plate: love affairs, a devoted husband. "I wish you were dead," Ruth said to the silent telephone. Chapter 3: Anthony Brown. Anthony Brown knew he had been a fool to get involved with Rosemary Barton. After all, he wasn't staying at Claridge's Hotel for pleasure. He was in London to work. But Rosemary was beautiful enough to excuse the fact that he was neglecting his business affairs for a little while. Luckily, his fascination with her soon began to fade, and he knew that it wasn't love after all, but they could still have a good time together. Rosemary danced wonderfully, and whenever they went out, other men turned round to stare at her. It was very pleasant, as long as you didn't want to talk to her. She couldn't even listen intelligently. But he had taken her out, danced with her, kissed her in taxis, and was on the way to making a bit of a fool of himself over her, until that incredible day. He remembered the expectant look in her dark blue eyes as she said softly, "Anthony Brown is a nice name." "It's very respectable," he replied lightly. There was an advisor to King Henry VIII called Anthony Brown. "But you must be from the Italian branch of the family." "Because of my brown skin? I had a Spanish mother." "Oh, that explains it, Mr. Anthony Brown." "You're very fond of my name," he laughed. "Well, it's nicer than Tony Morelli." He couldn't believe it. He caught hold of her arm. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was suddenly dangerous. "Who told you?" She laughed in delight at his reaction. "Someone who recognized you." "Who?" "This is serious, Rosemary." "My wicked cousin, Victor Drake." "I've never met him." "He probably wasn't using that name when you knew him." "I expect he had chosen to give a false one in order to save the family embarrassment," Anthony said slowly. "I see. So, you mean that we met in prison, then?" "Yes. I saw Victor recently, and I was telling him what a disgrace to the family he was when he grinned and said, 'You aren't so perfect yourself, sweetheart. I saw you last night dancing with a chap who calls himself Anthony Brown. In prison, we knew him as Tony Morelli." Anthony smiled. "Well, I'd like to see him again. We ex-prisoners must stick together." "You're too late. He sailed to South America yesterday." So you're the only person now who knows my guilty secret, Rosemary nodded. And I won't tell. You had better not. You don't want your pretty face slashed, do you? There are people around who are very happy to ruin a girl's beauty. And murder doesn't only happen in books and films. It happens in real life, too. Are you threatening me, Tony? I'm warning you. Forget the name Tony Morelli. Do you understand? But I don't mind, Tony. It's exciting to meet a criminal. You shouldn't be ashamed. He looked at her coldly, wondering how he could ever have cared for her. She was just a silly girl with a pretty face. He would have to leave. He couldn't trust her to keep his secret. She smiled her enchanting smile. Don't look so fierce. Will you take me to the Jarrows dance next week? I won't be here. I'm going away. Not before my birthday party. You can't. I've been very ill, and you mustn't upset me. You must come. He was going to refuse, but at that moment, through the open parlor door, he saw Iris Marl coming down the stairs. Tall and slim, with dark hair and gray eyes. And Anthony Brown changed his mind. Chapter 4: Stephen Faraday. From a young age, Stephen Faraday wanted to be successful. He was a quiet boy who studied hard. He earned a place at Oxford University. At 22, he finished his studies. He was known for speaking well, writing newspaper articles, and having good friends. Stephen wanted to work in politics. He was shy, but learned to be charming. People started saying, "He will go far." He joined the Conservative Party and was elected to Parliament. Stephen felt he had chosen the right career, but soon he realized he was not important in the government. He needed more than just his talent. He thought marriage could help him. He wanted to marry a woman from a powerful family who would support his career. One day, Stephen went to a party at Kidderminster House. The Kidderminster family was powerful in politics. They had 5 daughters, 3 of them very beautiful. Stephen noticed a tall, fair girl standing alone. She was Lady Alexandra Hale, the least attractive of the 5 daughters. She looked shy and uncomfortable. Stephen saw this as his chance. He went to her and started talking. He guessed she was too shy to tell him who she was. They talked about a play and politics. Stephen was careful not to stay too long. When Lady Kidderminster came to find her daughter, he left the party. He didn't want to meet the family yet. For several days, Stephen watched the house. He wanted to see Lady Alexandra alone. One morning, he saw her walking her dog in Hyde Park. Stephen hurried to get ahead so that when Sandra entered the park, he was already walking towards her. As they passed each other, he pretended to be surprised. "Oh, what luck! I didn't think I'd see you again. I'm Stephen Faraday, just an unimportant member of Parliament." She blushed and said, "I'm Alexandra, Sandra, Haley." Stephen acted surprised and embarrassed. "Lady Alexandra, you must have thought I was rude at the party. I should have known." "It doesn't matter, Mr. Faraday," she said quickly. "Please don't be upset. Let's walk to the river." After that, they often met in the park. They talked about politics, and Stephen found out that Sandra was smart and kind. They became friends, and soon Stephen was invited to dinner at Kidderminster House. He made a good impression on Sandra's parents. who thought he was a useful young man to know. 2 months later, Stephen proposed to Sandra. "Sandra, I love you, and I want to marry you. I believe I'll be successful one day. You won't be ashamed of your choice." "I'm not ashamed," she said. "Then you do care for me, darling." "Didn't you know?" "I hoped, but I wasn't sure. I've loved you since I first saw you and spoke to you. I was never more nervous in my life. I think I loved you then too." Sandra's parents weren't happy that she wanted to marry a man from an ordinary family with an unimportant job. But Lord Kidderminster knew his daughter was determined. If she wanted Faraday, she would marry him. "He has a promising career," Lord Kidderminster admitted, "and the Conservative Party needs young, talented members." Lady Kidderminster agreed, though reluctantly. "Then we will have to help him." Alexandra Haley married Stephen Faraday. They moved into a nice house in Westminster. Soon after, Sandra's godmother died and left her an old house in the countryside called Fairhaven. Stephen was doing well in his job. He worked in Parliament and had big dreams for his career. His wife was perfect, and everything was going as planned. At 32, Stephen felt successful. One day, the Faradays went on a holiday to St. Moritz, a skiing resort in the Swiss Alps. There, Stephen saw Rosemary Barton across the hotel lounge. He had told his wife a lie, but now it became the truth. Stephen fell deeply in love with Rosemary. He had never felt this way before. He thought of nothing but Rosemary's beautiful face, her red gold hair, and her perfect figure. He couldn't eat or sleep. They went skiing together, danced together, and Stephen wanted her more than anything. 2 weeks after they returned to London, Stephen became Rosemary's lover. Their affair lasted for 6 months. Stephen worked, but his mind was always on Rosemary. They met in secret, and he enjoyed every moment with her. But then, things changed. Stephen realized they were taking big risks. He worried that his wife, Sandra, might find out. He needed a break, so he went to Fairhaven with Sandra. It was peaceful there. He felt like he was recovering from an illness. He told Rosemary not to write to him while he was in Sussex. But one morning, he saw a letter from Rosemary at the breakfast table. He took it to his study and read it. Rosemary wrote that she loved him and missed him. Stephen thought it was sweet, but she shouldn't have written. It was too risky. Another letter arrived the next day. This time, Stephen thought Sandra noticed it, but she didn't say anything. After breakfast, Stephen drove to a nearby town and called Rosemary from a public telephone. "Hello, Rosemary?" "Stephen, darling, I have missed you. Have you missed me?" "Yes, of course. But don't write to me anymore. It's not safe." "Don't be silly, darling. What does it matter?" "I'm thinking of you, Rosemary. I don't care what happens to me." "Well, I care. When are you coming back?" "Tuesday." "Can't you come today?" "No, it's not possible." Stephen hung up, feeling tired. He knew they had to be more careful. After that, things got harder. Stephen was busy with work and couldn't see Rosemary much. But she didn't understand. She didn't care about his career. She just wanted to hear him say he loved her. She made impossible demands. She wanted them to meet in the south of France, somewhere they wouldn't be seen. But Stephen knew there was no place in the world where they wouldn't meet someone they knew. Rosemary said it wouldn't really matter if someone saw them. Stephen felt a chill. What do you mean? Rosemary smiled at Stephen. Darling, it's silly to keep this a secret. Let's stop pretending. George will divorce me and your wife will divorce you. Then we can get married. Stephen was horrified. This would ruin everything. I won't let you do that, he said. But darling, it doesn't matter what people think. It matters to me. A scandal would destroy my career. But there are so many other things you could do, and we don't need anything. I have lots of money. We could travel the world. Stephen realized Rosemary was beautiful, but she didn't understand. She could ruin his life. He told her they must end it for her sake. He couldn't risk making her unhappy. But Rosemary said she adored him and couldn't live without him. She wanted to tell the truth. She would tell George, and Sandra would divorce Stephen. His career would be over. Everything would be ruined. He would lose Sandra. Stephen suddenly realized losing Sandra was his biggest fear. His dear, loyal Sandra. No, he had to keep Rosemary quiet. I won't do anything until after my birthday, Rosemary said. It would be too cruel. George is so excited about it. But Stephen was worried. If he told Rosemary he didn't love her anymore, she might go to George or even Sandra. She could cry and say, he doesn't care anymore, but he's just being loyal to you. I know you'll agree that honesty is best when people love each other. So please give him his freedom. Sandra would let him go. She wouldn't believe Stephen loved her. How could she, if Rosemary showed her the letters he had written? He had never written such letters to Sandra. Stephen thought, it's a pity we don't live in the days of the Borgias. A glass of poisoned champagne seemed the only way to keep Rosemary quiet. A week later, there was cyanide in Rosemary's champagne glass. And across the table, Stephen's eyes met Sandra's.